Hi, everyone. This is Milou Meier. I'm a cybersecurity and privacy lawyer, and I do fractional chief compliance officer services through a company called Compliance Counsel. And you're listening to the DiscoPosse podcast.
Fantastic. I love it. You're a pro on microphone and a pro in many, many other ways, as we're going to chat about today, Milu. So thank you for joining. For folks that are probably saying, hey, wait a second, I feel familiarity. Of course, I was lucky enough to have you on the show in the past, where we had your co-podcaster, Brian Knutson, and we talked about socializing security. And since then, I can't remember exactly when that was. It's all a blur because, life is a blur. But a lot of things have happened along the way. So we've got some news and things that have happened to you. So maybe let's get a fresh start. And Milu, if you want to give a quick introduction of yourself, and we'll talk about Compliance Counsel, and then we'll jump into a bit of an interesting, we're going to go the AI and law route because I'm sure it hasn't been talked about enough, but we're going to talk about it in the way that will be very different from how other people have heard this discussion go before.
Yeah, we do still have, Brian and I are still hosting our podcast, Socializing Security. So we are happy to say we've hit a year. So that was an exciting milestone. I think you were one of our first guests, for the podcast. So when we were really trying to figure out what it was. So we still do that, and we talk about anything, IT compliance, product marketing, tech, relatively generic, so that we can have fun and talk to cool people. So, such as yourself. So yeah, we're still doing that. And then, so I have been a director of compliance for many different companies. And, I've built out compliance programs against some of the largest industry standards like SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, GDPR, high trust, and more recently NIST and FedRAMP. So building out pretty large compliance programs, and ended up deciding that I wanted to go do that on my own and work with companies directly as a fractional chief compliance officer. So helping them build out programs, whether that's, a company that doesn't have anything and they're, trying to get a SOC 2 for the first time, or a company that has a more mature program that's now suddenly bringing on a more challenging program like FedRAMP or something like that.
And there is no shortage of number of acronym driven certifications to get, and the depth of difficulty in making that and staying compliant in those frameworks. It's a real wild world to me. And I came from, I worked in tech as a systems architect for big financial and insurance companies. And I've worked in healthcare. I worked for an explosives company. So I've seen a whole lot of wild regulations. And no matter how much further we are along into the industry, we are still constantly having the same challenges, and everybody has to do it. There's no fast track. There's certain things that just can't be avoided or can't be automated as much as we'd like. There's certain things that can be automated, but I really see this as such a fantastic human-centric industry role. And mostly because the person that's on the other side of non-compliance is likely another human, maybe system-driven in how they get alerted or how they learn about things, but ultimately we have the human API between these contracts. And it's funny, it really works out the same as networking. In networking, we have simple things. We have a contract, we send a certain amount of data. On the other side is the receiving contract. It matches, life is good. As soon as one's out of sync, somebody complains, and it's a human that gets called. To my view, as far as we see law and AI, generative AI being able to participate in assisting with some stuff around compliance and privacy, it's still so far off, or the risk is not even just non-zero. The risk is significant if people go in blindly into just let me grab the next tool. I'll ask Perplexity. God bless the fine folks of Perplexity. This is not neither an endorsement nor a detract up against them, but like if I go to Perplexity and tell it to tell me, am I compliant? I mean, it's going to smile and say, "Gotcha, boss." And then I'll say, "No, you missed this," and it'll be like, "Oh, you're totally right. I was wrong there." And you're like, that's the funny thing about these things. They're as profoundly proud and confident as much as they are wrong. So
Yeah, they can be really helpful tools, but they definitely also need good individuals reviewing the outputs, because very often, like, how would you know, right? If you were asking Perplexity, for example, does this meet the compliance standard? It might actually just give you the answer that you're looking for based off of how you've prompted it to, right?
it's I wish I had friends that were as easy to maneuver into the right answer as ChatGPT and the like are. But let's backtrack, because you've done a lot to really directly impact single organizations, and then you made the jump to being a fractional entrepreneur. And this is two really cool challenges. One is obviously branching out and taking, like, you've got such fantastic skills, it's no doubt. You've got value that you could add not just to a single place, but having multiple organizations be able to get a little bit of Milu is a good thing. But then fractional is interesting because that gives you the ability to kind of say, like, this is how much of my mind that I can slice up, rather than coming at it as an agency. I like that you've taken this first step. I mean, I guess coming from the legal background is probably how law firms are generated, right? You work for a partner, a group of partners, and then all of a sudden you say, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to go on my own. And maybe you find one other partner eventually. And the next thing you know, you've got a firm. So what did the transition look like, and how's it going?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it was, I was reached out to by a company that was kind of like, hey, we would love to start working with you. And I was still kind of working full time and was thinking about, is this something that I could really actually figure out? Could I do this full time? And then, I decided that was the opportunity to be like, okay, I'm going to jump for this one and see how it goes. And I was fortunate I had another referral really quickly after. So from there, it came relatively organically. I think it's going well. I think it's hard to figure out, though, like, how do you get more clients and how do you know that you're the right fit for other companies? And I think that's the part that I'm probably struggling with as the business owner, of figuring out, how do I build out that pipeline? I think that's the part that is probably the biggest challenge at the moment. Right now, the service delivery for the existing clients is going really well, and I'm enjoying working with them, but it's starting to figure out, like, how do you bring on more business?
Yeah, well, and you've done the right thing, though. Execute well, and then the clients come. It's a lot harder to have a bunch of clients if you can't execute, and I think that's really where most folks, I mean, I've even found the growth in my company. There's been a couple of points where I'm like very carefully moving ahead, and you can see there's like risk points that get introduced at certain scale and with certain process improvements and trying to do something. And of course, technology is changing around us. The industry goes up and down, but all in all, I'd say if you can crack the business outcome problem for your clients, then we just have to get that amplified, right? It's really build the store, and then let's go and paper them all with flyers until we can get people to come to the store. But if you don't build the store, most people these days are just papering the flyers, seeing if it's worth building the store. I like that you're already proving it in practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's been great. And again, luckily, a lot of that just came from word of mouth of people just like I've worked with before, or knowing that this is what I'm doing. And so that was really lovely to have your own community kind of vouch for you is great. But yeah, of trying to figure out what is on the flyers, right? What is it that I'm offering that, other services might also have, or something like that? What's the differentiator for Compliance Counsel?
So what exactly would you see if you would describe the role as a fractional compliance leader in an organization? Who's your kind of optimal client type that you would look for as a quick hit? And then what functionally do you find yourself doing in that role?
Yeah, so I think most of the time it's probably startup organizations that probably don't have a very large compliance infrastructure, right? If a large organization already has an existing compliance team, then that's probably not going to be the right fit. So it's generally smaller companies, tech startups that are looking for their next large compliance thing, or they have, they've suddenly signed a contract that they have agreed to something that, maybe they're not ready for. And so it's bringing in somebody who can kind of help steer the leadership and strategy to get to that point. And then from there, honestly, the day-to-day looks vastly different depending on what the client is and what we're working on. Some of it is working with, other consulting partners that they're working with. Say they have like an internal auditor or something and working with that team member. I think a lot of it is managing the program to making sure that also like things are just happening when they're supposed to. I think there's certain things I always joke about of like access reviews. Like companies hate doing those, and it's one of those things that's such a quick gotcha in technology audits that they just forgot to check access. And so it's also just making sure that their standard controls are operating in a regular cadence and that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing to maintaining their existing standards. Because what's tricky sometimes is when we're focusing on the flashy new thing that's really hard, we forget to maintain the existing infrastructure that supports the prior programs. And then we have issues where, we get findings because we didn't do an access review or something silly in an audit. So it's also just making sure that they're keeping their program moving while they're trying to think about how do we do this new, big, difficult thing.
Yeah, well, that's just it. It's a lot that goes on, not just as a one-time delivery, but like you said, there's maintenance stuff. There are, quarterlies. There are annual requirements. There are even just day to day. You should really have certain checklists and flows that people are doing. There's certain, obviously the compliance software industry is growing like wildfire. I've got a few friends that are, doing that, but they're usually specifically targeted to one compliance framework, or they're specifically targeted to a particular vertical. It's a tricky, in the end, no matter how much software and no matter how good the LLMs have gotten to date, I really do feel that this is just such a beautifully, like I said, a human-centric function that can be AI assisted, but it is so subjective in active delivery. As objective as the outcome is, compliant, non-compliant, right? Levels of compliance. They're fairly binary, but it's so subjective in, do we need to do that? Like, does this really apply? Because quite often if I go through that checklist and there's like 14,000 line items, if you get the super spreadsheet of all the different frameworks, like, what do I even do with this? Like, for me to spend all this time going through this, I'm going to waste time figuring out what I need to do. I'm going to end up doing stuff that actually doesn't apply, or worse, I'm going to be like, I don't think this applies. Oh, and then you're going to find out the hard way when you go to get certified. Oh, yeah, sorry, kid, you failed your SOC 2 because your primary guy is located in Ottawa, Canada, and you're in the United States. Like, oh, darn. Stuff like that.
Yeah, the gotchas, you'll never know. But I can't imagine 14,000 controls, but it does get up to that, right? Like even a SOC 2 is generally like 75 controls, but if you're thinking about you're testing all of the evidence for it, you're still collecting. I mean, I think in a normal SOC 2, I think you're gathering like 1,500 pieces of evidence. So it is super laborious for companies also to just maintain and manage their existing programs of just actually like being in the audit and collecting the evidence that you need and showing all the configurations. It's just really time intensive, and it is still very human driven. As much as there are a lot of governance, risk, and compliance GRC automation softwares that are trying to reduce the physical work associated with gathering evidence, it's still very manual. I wish it were less, but and some of it is helping if you have those integrations directly tied into some of your main infrastructure providers. A lot of those then, some of those controls are easier to evidence directly in those tools. But for the most part, again, a lot of it is still just capturing screenshots and managing it through spreadsheets.
Yeah, God bless Microsoft Excel. If Microsoft could spin out Excel as its own company, we would find out that it generates more revenue than Microsoft itself, I think, at this point. Like spreadsheets, we always say it's like the things that every tech team is fighting as your competitor: status quo and spreadsheets, and then your competitors. It is literally always like people don't want to do anything different. The spreadsheets work, and somebody else is doing the same thing and competing against you. It's wild that it's always the third before you even look at another tool. So if I would think about what's the wins you see right now, Milu, in where like software has taken us and where potentially AI is on the verge of getting us in what it can do. What do you see as the right ways to utilize software and tools so that you can ultimately free your time for your clients and, to maintain, better throughput while maintaining your own, low risk and like keeping compliant? What are you seeing as the positives and the risks in running out the software route?
Yeah, I think when you're using or choosing to like go after and automate something with software, right? Ideally, you're hoping that the use case is really going to deliver sufficient value. I have a hard time when teams just bring on a tool that does one thing, right? And then they're like, and now we need another thing. And so I think it's being mindful of, can the platform actually achieve the goals, and making sure that the procurement team is super aware of like, what is the team actually trying to solve for when they're saying we need this thing, and making sure too that the procurement process is involved enough that they're pretty clear on, can the product actually deliver and fix that issue that the company is facing, right? That they're saying, hey, we really need to outsource this and we need to bring in a new technology provider specifically to solve for X. I think on top of that, with generative AI, I think for the most part, as long as it's providing additional efficiency and making it easier for people to get their work done and to do their jobs, then I see a lot of value in it, of actually investing in it, to making sure that you're expanding the tool set to operation. Sorry, that's an odd word, but sorry, I have a bit of a tongue twister, but to make sure that the teams are actually investing in tools and softwares that make it easier for them to do their jobs, I think is worth it. But I do think you have to be mindful of the gotchas of making sure that you're not investing in a ton of additional technology and increasing spend, because ultimately, again, what are you really trying to get out of the tool? I think making sure that it's very clear of what the technology is doing. Is it solving for the team? And then great, if it has AI technology built into it that's going to make it easier to manage and easier to deploy and implement within an organization, I think that's worth looking into. But for the most part, again, it needs to make sure you're using software that actually is fixing your team's needs and actually addressing the problem versus just like creating more work. Because very often we get a software and then suddenly it's like more work to actually implement or maintain the software.
Right. Yeah. The first thing you have to do is become an expert in the software. And now your job is maintaining that software versus it was the job before was doing the thing the software was supposed to help you to do.
100%.
Now you're the software's boss, which I suppose there's some level of efficiency we could say we can sneak out of that. But yeah, you have to really trust it. And that's one of the biggest things why I find it's very difficult to get repeatability and to get transparency and explainability with a lot of the generative tooling. So generative AI tooling is famously difficult because it's very black box. You put in the same answer at the front. It's like chaos theory. A different answer comes out the back. We all watch the Jurassic Park where he talks about the water going off your knuckles. Like, it is entirely unknown. We can narrow the band on what we believe will come out, but in the end, it's going to vary. And it's just sort of the nature of generative AI. It's not to say that there isn't other AI tooling that's more the algorithmic mathematical stuff that's fixed input, fixed output. It's a little bit more, value is understood and trust is understood. But yeah, anything that's generative, I'm still telling people, like, be careful how much you lean into it, because it will disappoint you at some point, and hopefully not in a way that ends up with you, being the plaintiff or the defendant in some situation where you're having to fight for something that happened or be fought on something that happened as a result of software.
Yeah, I think people also just have to be so mindful of what information they're actually putting into these LLMs.
That's
I
true,
think
yeah.
the amount of people that I'm sure are putting in confidential information into these tools and are hoping that these outputs like are secured within those and not actually training on your company's proprietary information, I think is probably terrifying. And I feel like that's something a lot of employees are most likely doing, just copying and pasting without thinking like, should I pull out company name at least or redact it? And are really most likely putting in way too much information into those tools.
I think that's going to be one of the ones where more and more people are, yeah, just, and it's as simple. We tell them to do the simple things, right? Oh, like take this spreadsheet of customers and like organize it into a mail merge. You're like, that's fantastic. And it happens in minutes. And you're like, but you do, even if you are paying for a product and you're allegedly, according to the contract, getting a private storage space that's not being used for training. Well, it's not to say that those T's and C's don't get updated in a year. And oh, by the way, we're training on data prior to this year. Like some little thing that sneaks in. And we saw this with all of these software tools. Adobe sort of famously got bitten by suddenly saying, hey, by the way, we're training on all of your data and we can resell it and showcase it as an Adobe product. And you're like, wait a second, that's not cool at all. And that's just, for most people, there's no greater lie than one backed by statistics. And the second is the one that says, I agree and have read the terms and conditions. Like we just scroll to the bottom, check off the box and say, submit. I just want to use my software, please. What do you see as the thing that people who are in a startup and they need to prepare for compliance? Like when does compliance have to show up on their personal radar as a founder because that's the hard part. I don't even know when to call until I'm usually being presented with a contract from somebody going, oh, by the way, can you show me your X certification? And you're like, oh, okay, gotcha. I need to do some work.
I think most of it is still very much customer driven. I think for the most part, startups are probably not going to invest into compliance until a customer's like, hey, you have to have a SOC 2 or hey, you have to be HIPAA compliant. So I think within the industry, it's still very much customer driven and it's coming out of contractual obligations and requirements. So I think it's very rare that a startup would pursue that until they're legally required to do so. I wish they would be more proactive about it, but again, it also costs money. So it's tricky because they don't want to spend the money until they're required to. And very often that is still coming from customer expectations and compliance requirements, specifically coming out of contractual obligations for suddenly they land their large customer and the large customer is like, hey, you have to have a SOC 2. And that's still the case.
Well, and I think that's probably where I was always going to be. Like at some point, especially when you're growing the company, you don't want to take on services or costs that aren't, being offset by revenue. And unless someone is screaming for SOC 2 compliance, then it's not necessarily something you need to chase after. But so then that call comes. And they say, okay, Milu, I saw you on a podcast and you look like you can help me out here. So I got a customer, they're a large bank. They need me to have SOC 2 compliance. I'm hoping to close this deal by July 1. What are the chances? How can you help me? What does that first call look like and what is your like onboarding and how do you learn about the client to be able to sort of scope out what it's going to take to help them through that journey?
I think of course it depends on every client, right? Every customer is different, but I do think for the most part, if you had a circumstance, right, where a customer was like, you have to have this thing, it would be very much talking to them about being like, hey, we don't have this yet and we need to get ready for it. And could you work with us so that, we have this in 6 months or something, right? Like, I think realistically, like a reporting period for SOC 2 has to be 3 months, right? That's the minimum time period that a audit firm can look at to actually test that the controls were working. So I think if you're building out the framework, it would be working with the customer to then coming up with a timeline of saying, hey, we're going to need 6 months to be able to get that. And that's going to be a realistic goal for us, to being like, we're going to bring somebody in, we're going to do a readiness assessment, we're going to fix the gaps, and then we're going to turn into a reporting period of 3 months and start from there. And then from there, move it on annually. So I think if it came up at the first pass with a customer that was requiring it, you would have to have a pretty frank conversation with them about being like, we can't do this until we have 6 months, because we have to, one, build the program and then also audit against it, right? And have that minimum 3-month reporting period. So, and again, I do think for startups, I do think a lot of customers are usually willing to being like, okay, like if that's a realistic timeline, maybe that we can make that work. I think as long as you're upfront about it, otherwise I wouldn't say, don't overcommit to something if you're not ready for it. But I do think you'd have to be realistic with the timeline of saying like, hey, we don't have this yet, and we need this amount of time before we get that thing.
When stuff like FedRAMP is probably one of the most interesting ones in the tech startup. I mean, I'm exposed to this a lot more than most other regulations lately, just because sooner or later you're going to hit a public sector, prospect, and they're going to say, "Hey, I need you guys to be FedRAMP," and that's not a simple process. Like, well, so when obviously SOC 2, no small battle into itself. There's reasons why these regulations exist too. Like I'm all about a good free market, but I also am all about good guardrails that allow that free market to freely move and safely move, and it creates a trust in execution, right? So as much as I would poo-poo the idea that, I don't want to deal with this regulatory stuff, I'm sure glad it's there, because I know that my competitors and my customers all will respect that we're doing the same battle together. So with FedRAMP, what does that onboarding look like? Because I'm sure a lot of people hear FedRAMP all the time and they don't even really know.
Yeah, that one takes conservatively probably like 18 months to really get fully certified. It depends, right? There's 3 different levels. There's low, moderate, and high. I think most organizations end up going after moderate because that's just kind of like the baseline standard. It's relatively rare that organizations going down the path are going to do low, because most of federal agencies that they might want to work with are going to require moderate anyways.
Right.
So to do that, you usually work with a consulting firm to do like a readiness assessment and gap analysis against the 340 controls or so to see where you're at. And then obviously you would need to build out remediation to actually address the gaps. And then, yeah, FedRAMP itself is most likely probably conservatively like 18 months to actually get the authorization in hand. There have been some developments over the last couple months where they now have like the FedRAMP 20X program, which is like an accelerated path to get low, which is really compelling for SaaS companies. It has to be, they have to be like cloud-based companies that already have a SOC 2 type 2 that are only using, FedRAMP authorized technologies basically to be able to get that low authorization. So that path should be much quicker. That should be like a couple months to be able to get that. And then you maintain like a low 20X authorization for a year, I think, if you do it that way. So there has been some positive change to make that program and process a little bit easier. And they're splitting it up into 2 phases. So this is phase 1. And if you get FedRAMP 20X, if you pass the assessment and you do that with a third-party assessor and you're on the marketplace, then they're saying that they'll prioritize a phase 2 that'll make it easier to get moderate through this pilot program.
Gotcha. That's cool. Well, I mean, it's a slow-moving industry in general, because these are very appropriate standards that we've put in place. Like we always chuckle about them after the fact, or we complain about them. It's just because it's like, I don't want to deal with this. But like, it's absolutely, this stuff is there for a reason. It's like when there's a sign on a piece of equipment, it says "Do not tip." That's usually in hindsight. So when FedRAMP has all these requirements, it's going to make sense. So I do like that the fast track's there. Like I said, at least get you started down the road, and it shows intent. And I think actually, I was happy that in working with audits in the past, that that's a very human piece of it as well. It can be accidental, and they go, oh, okay, like there's an understanding about stuff that we missed versus stuff that we went around, and intent is buried inside that, and that's why you as the representative can help to guide them towards like, okay, I know we don't want to do this piece, but it's like we have no choice, and oh, we've kind of been a little lazy on this, so let's just make sure we keep that up to date and make it weekly, monthly, or whatever. Like, so for you, again, like, how much is it the human side of you, like coaching people why they have to do a certain thing versus the relatively mundane activities of doing all these evidence gathering and all this other stuff?
I think the why is usually pretty easy to define, and customers are usually relatively quick to understanding why they need to be doing the requirements. I think a lot of my work ends up being a lot of the like administrative, more mundane task work of actually making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and gathering evidence and preparing for audits. So I would say it's less glamorous than it might seem, but you want to make sure that someone is actually validating that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and making sure that things are moving forward. I think I love the idea of accelerating FedRAMP, and I think that's a really positive thing actually that came out with the recent administration change, because that's really kind of what inspired that, and making it a more equitable marketplace, just because also FedRAMP is super expensive. So
Yeah.
most technology companies just can't even jump into it because it's just super cost prohibitive. So making it this accelerated path is significantly less expensive. Again, it's not the moderate authorization, but it's at least a step in the right direction. And it'll be curious to see what phase 2 looks like, to seeing for the companies that have this 20x low, what does it look like for them to become moderate? Is it a less expensive path, and is it an easier path? I think that'll be really exciting to see within the industry.
I like anything we can do to just make it a lower barrier to entry for new organizations, because there's such amazing innovation going on, and this then becomes a tough barrier, and it shouldn't be just like anything. I mean, just like college shouldn't be the cost that it is in the United States. It's like we shouldn't have these barriers to entry. And because what it does, it effectively just eliminates this sort of like the middle group of people that want to get into SaaS provider worlds. And yeah, like if it's absolutely, there's no way, it's prohibitive to take on this cost, then immediately they're like 2 years away from ever getting a government client. And they have to have almost guarantees that they're going to have a client at the end of it to get started. So then so you have to, even worse, you have to sell as if you're going to have it, just until you get somebody that says, I need you to have it. And then they're not going to say, I need you to have it. See you in 18 months. Let me know when it's ready. They're going to go, sorry, who's your closest competitor that already has this certification? Thanks. That's fantastic. Like they're going to hang up the phone. Like it's a tough barrier for a lot of companies, I think.
Yeah, especially because you have to have that federal agency that's willing to sponsor you throughout the process, right? So through the traditional authorization process, you can't start unless you have that one government customer in your pocket that's like, we want to work with you, and are, again, willing to wait until we get that authorization in the first place, which means they can't pipe any data into the system while they're waiting for their authorization to operate in the meantime.
This is why we can't have nice things, Milu. This is so hard. It shouldn't be this difficult. But that's why, and this is why there's such sort of subjective processes that are very difficult for people to understand. And that's why I think you're in the right spot for how much you can affect the industry with, what you can bring to it. So, and, looking at your background and the people that have given you recommendations, there's obviously no doubt that I'm not alone in endorsing your talents. That people are seeing this. What do you see as the most exciting thing for you about starting fresh and taking on this as a provider now, not as an employee?
I think obviously it's exciting to see, your work product really affect other organizations and feel like you're really supporting them and helping them solve challenges, I think is like a really nice differentiator. Of course, obviously you felt that when you're working in-house and you feel like you're part of a organization that's moving forward and trying to, you know, move tasks down the list and making sure that things are getting done. But I do think I feel like a better sense of responsibility of saying like my work product is really helping them achieve XYZ goal. And I am within the room working with their stakeholders to making sure that they're accomplishing what they need to be doing and are getting support from me with some of the things that are really their challenges. And it's also nice to have a diverse workload, right? To not just be working on one thing all the time. It's nice to be working with different clients that are working with different challenges, different audit frameworks, different certifications. So that also helps create a more varied day to day. I think it's nice to not be stuck in doing, certain policy reviews for your one full-time role and are able to kind of diversify your workload. So I enjoy that. And I think it's really nice to see the value that I'm delivering to different clients and also that the work just looks different.
Yeah, that is nice to be able to like. I've been lucky enough that every once in a while it hits me. I'm like, I get to do exactly what I love, and then lather, rinse, and repeat for multiple clients. And it's a lot of crazy context switching because I have to sort of get into that role, get into that messaging space, understand the problem set. But it's like I can move into that area and it's like, and I can do something that's super exciting and then move on to the next client and then do that same thing again with a fresh experience. And like, I'm excited because I'm always doing the ground up. I'm learning myself and I've like throw myself towards it because I love that challenge of taking on versus when I was in-house. Eventually you're like, this probably doesn't need to be done till next week. Like this really isn't. I've worked with this manager before. These projects never come together, so I'm just going to slow play this one, and it won't make it through the quarterly business review. You're like, there. But when you're from the outside, every day is the greatest day ever and the hardest day ever. It's such a fantastic dichotomy.
Absolutely.
What do you love about what got you to even start down this road? Because you're in talking with you on the podcast, it's obvious that you really care deeply about this stuff. You're not just doing it because you learn about it and you can repeat it. What brought you here, Milu?
I think for me, it was always, I absolutely love helping companies do the right thing. And again, I like being in the room with the stakeholders and making sure that they're thinking through compliance as hopefully a business driver and not the police. We definitely don't want that culture of, compliance being the team to say no. I think my culture has always been very much compliance as the team that's saying yes and, XYZ guardrails, right? Of making sure
Yeah.
that they're involved in the decision making. I think I'm super passionate about this stuff. And so that has always really helped I like what I do in my day-to-day. So I like helping companies think through what are security controls that can actually help them not only secure their systems, but also protect customer data and achieve XYZ things. So I think for me, it comes from a lot of, I enjoy understanding what those security controls are and building out the processes that are needed to support those within an organization. I think I also find it exciting when we're thinking about building out, systems to making sure that they are built with privacy by design and secure elements within, if you actually have a company that's thinking through security throughout their software development lifecycle, as opposed to just thinking about it on the back end or, oh shoot, we forgot that might have privacy implications. I think it's really great when you're working with companies that are being proactive about it and also are thinking about how can compliance be a competitive edge. I think that's something that very often, again, yes, compliance occasionally comes up because a customer requires it, but also occasionally you need to look at what your competitors have, right? And are you making sure that you're keeping abreast of the changes and are actually able to say, hey, we have XYZ accolade, or we're already going after that because we think it's the right thing to do, not just because we're required to do it.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing. This is not all, hindsight stuff. And it's funny when you talked about like no or like the even in IT, we used to like as an IT ops person, I would always get accused of being like the harbingers of doom because we're always saying like, oh, you can't just throw this thing in there. Who knows what could happen to the servers or the network or whatever. We have to be careful with this stuff. And they'd always see it as like, oh, you guys are always holding up business projects because you have all these rules. And it was like, no. There's no, and then there's yes because. So I'm going to say yes because we have to be involved in it. It has a business requirement. It has a like a hard line answer that you're either compliant or non-compliant if you are on the wrong side of this particular threshold or because some systems threshold based, some is very simple Boolean, it's on or off, but there's a surprising amount of stuff that is very, like I said, subjective. It can be threshold based, so there's ranges in which you feel you can work. So you must have an interesting thought process because you have to work in such like, this is the maze of rules, but then here are I think I found a shortcut here. And when is it safe? Like what is it about your mind that lets you think in these almost opposing worlds?
I think I like to be in the gray space for sure. I think attorneys are more black and white, and I think compliance professionals are more gray, where we have these rules and requirements of things that we can and cannot do, but then the actual practical application of what that looks like within your organization is completely gray because it's not necessarily like a yes or no. And I think there's also varying like risk differs within different organizations, right? What works for one company might not work for the other, or what is a high risk for one is a low risk for the other, just based off of their particular fact patterns. So I think what I like doing is very much playing in that gray space of being like, this is not just black and white. So if a company is saying this is the challenge and these are our requirements, can we come up with a path that we feel like we're meeting all or most of the requirements still within a way that's not holding the business back dramatically? Because I think that's where a lot of companies get held up on occasionally, is they're like, we can't do this thing because we're not this, or instead of coming about it being like, these are our current controls and this is our current risk profile, and coming up with a plan that works for them, even occasionally swallowing that risk of saying we're not 100% there, but we're going to be in this amount of time and are willing to actually take on that risk. I think that's where, again, I think occasionally attorneys might differ with compliance professionals on that sometimes, where, it's either you have this or you don't, versus, hey, we have some of this and we're working towards the rest of it, but we need to keep delivering in the meantime. And I think that's kind of, compliance professionals need to be willing to operate in that gray space as opposed to just saying like yes or no.
There is a beauty and a joy in the sort of semantics of it. I do appreciate it, and I love, especially like I love watching like legal arguments too, because it's so funny. Like you're like, huh, both sides are kind of right, and so it's really difficult to interpret threshold based things, and so I always love the way that people are very just, it's neat the way that they use semantics in a way that allows you to be specific enough, but a little bit, as much wiggle room as possible without being non-specific. it's a funny personality, and it's a funny style of thinking, because you really have to think differently about, like this is the hard rules and these are the soft rules of, I do this in life with certain things, but I love the mindset. And we all, of course, we when people say like, I want to get into being a lawyer or into the legal field, the first thing you think is you're going to be like Tom Cruise, like, did you order the code red? You're goddamn right. Like, no, that's not, even if you are, a court representing attorney, if you're actually doing that type of representation, you're probably not on these contentious gotcha moments very often. You're probably doing a lot of mundane behind the scenes stuff, so that when you get to that room and it is the real true subjective discussion around where do the objective rules come into play, it seems sexy from the outside that I'm going to go and get to scream at Jack Nicholson in the witness stand until he turns red and pops. What drew you early towards this stuff?
Yeah, I was fortunate that when I was in law school, I was able to intern with a large defense manufacturer, actually. And was working with them on building out an anti-human trafficking and slavery policy because that was what was coming up out of the UK. And what was really interesting to me about it was we had these rules and requirements, but how do we take those and explain them across an organization at all different levels? So how is it that somebody that's working on a manufacturing line can understand the red flags for potential, you know, human trafficking violations, as opposed to just seeing a policy, right? And so understanding that compliance is taking those requirements and is charged with then actually making sure that they're understandable across the organization, across different experience levels and different day-to-day tasks, right? Somebody in corporate has a very different red flag monitor than somebody that's actually working within the supply chain in the plant. And so for me, it was actually realizing like, oh, there is a very tangible thing of importance here of actually explaining to employees working within this organization of what this actually looks like and helping them find those signs. And so that to me took the, oh, it's not just theoretical and it's not just like a legal theory. It's actually what is the practical application of the law and how do we actually enforce it within our organization and customize it? And that was what really drew me to compliance in the first place.
So let's go 5 further years back, or even maybe a little further. What made you decide that law school was the place you were heading?
Ooh, why did I go to law school in the first place? I think, of course, I was good at debate. Um, but no, I think for the most part, I actually went and interned at a law firm when I was in college to see are these the type of people that I want to have as my colleagues? So are these the
Good
type of,
call. Yeah,
yeah,
that's awesome.
yeah. And so I ended up working at a large law firm to figure out, are these the type of individuals I want to be as my colleagues to do work with? And I saw that a lot of them, they were working on exciting things and they had diverse backgrounds. And for the most part, they enjoyed what they did. They were in a very traditional legal practice. And so I knew pretty early on that I was going to go a non-traditional route and was going to go explore a path down compliance as opposed to, being in a courtroom or even sitting in a law firm. So for me, it was really figuring out, are these the type of people I want to work with? And then what is it that I want to do with that degree?
That's cool. That's cool. So you mentioned debate, so that it probably actually puts you in a really good position as far as being able to be in that discussion of the value that you can deliver. Because in a weird way, it is almost, you have to sort of, we want to influence them towards seeing that value. But sometimes you find yourself having to quickly defend yourself, but in a way that's not some loose answer. Like and in debate, that's always the amazing thing is you can only get away with the word salad for so long. Eventually they're gonna be like, no, let's, you're heading down a completely, or this is a red herring, let's pull back. And and we learn all these techniques around making sure you don't get in there. There's certain gotcha things that we learn in debate because of like semantic meandering you can do to force someone to say something like, aha, but 10 minutes ago you said that you were affirmative on this, which if I use my hypothetical no longer applies. Aha. But when you're in like talking to somebody, part of the thing around influence and selling is I need to get them to see the value and they want to share as little information as possible. So we have to be able to like gently move the conversation, ask questions that get towards our desired outcome, but don't sound like 20 questions. Like there's a way of sort of sneaking it in and like getting them to like nod along at some point. What is it that you loved the most about that human exchange, and especially as you get into new clients? That must be exciting that every time you're like, oh, I get to learn all about your company now. This is cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it's also, I think I can demonstrate my passion for compliance relatively easily. So for very often, when I'm meeting a new organization for the first time or just talking about this stuff, I think it is pretty clear that I care probably more than most about doing the right thing and making sure that organizations are actually like doing what they're saying they're supposed to be doing. And doing it in a way, right, that works for them. So I think for me, it's always, I'm very excited to, of course, learn about a company's internal systems and how they're processing information and what they're doing and, where they are currently at. And then thinking too about what are their goals for their differentiators, specifically when we're talking about compliance and security, of what is it that they really want to be able to achieve and to do. And so I think I really enjoy working with different organizations that are excited about building a culture of security within the organization. That's really important. I hope most of them want to go beyond merely checking the box and saying, we do the bare minimum and that's enough. I think that when we're talking about compliance and security, compliance might be the bare minimum. Security usually means we're not doing enough.
Yeah.
So compliance does not necessarily mean security, right? So I think I get super excited when I'm working with a new client, learning their systems and hearing also what are their goals when they're talking about building a culture around security within the organization.
And it's probably tough too, because compliance is often even difficult to excite somebody inside about, like, because usually the person that's bound by the, this is getting between me and revenue, they're not necessarily in the day-to-day trying to drive this activity. They're trying to drive revenue generation. This is a barrier to that. And so now they're basically like, dump it on legal, dump it on, compliance, dump it on that team. And later, like, I just want this done because I need to get there. But you are likely first called by that person saying, hey, my internal team needs help. And I saw you on this podcast and like, I need to get there. So I need you to come in. And so that person's going to engage with you almost to be like, I need you to get my team to get off their butts and get this done. So there's a fun thing that how sort of rushed does it ever feel when someone comes to you versus how much is like planful? Not that it's never not planful, but like, what's that first call sound like and feel like for that person who's is just looking for help?
Yeah, I don't think it's usually rushed. I think for the most part, they're usually coming with, this is the path or these are the roadblocks that we're experiencing. And this is the challenge that we need you to really come in and help us fix. I think luckily it's never really feeling like too stressed. I think sometimes they are coming with some really aggressive timelines, right? About being like, yeah, we need to have this thing by this date, and thinking through like, is that reasonable? And working with them about being like, that timeline might work, or hey, we need to readjust our expectations. And so I think for the most part, they're usually coming to me with a relatively thoughtful, like, we have these goals in mind and we know that we need somebody to help us wrangle that and make sure that we're meeting those goals internally. So fortunately, it doesn't ever feel like too rushed, but it can feel a little chaotic, right? Because when I do start with a new client, it's very much like I am drinking from a fire hose, right? It's figuring out what they do in the first place and then what are their processes and where are they even at. So that part feels relatively intense. But then I think for the most part, once you're aware of what they're doing and are helping, then I think it usually is pretty smooth sailing.
Yeah, I guess it's probably that interesting thing that we want it to move faster, but we also know that certain things just have to happen in a particular order and they take a particular amount of time because of a particular amount of data that needs to back that activity. But in the end, we'd all say it'd be really cool if we could somehow get this faster, which is probably why there's a boom right now in people trying out compliance software and trying out these other things. But it is like, I just find it so individualistic. And that's why, like, I said this like from the start, like the human connection is so much an important part of every engagement, because software is great. Like I use QuickBooks. I wouldn't want to represent what I put into QuickBooks at an audit. That's why I have an accountant. And like, this is one of those things. This is not just a checkbox compliance. This is like, I want to move my business capabilities forward and up. And that's why I'm making this decision to get the certification. It's not just because I'm like, oh gosh, I got to get my certification. It's like, for us to grow as an organization, we need to do this thing. But what this does, it unlocks what's next, right? Like that revenue opportunity is now greatly increased for these companies. So in fact, like, you are such a beautiful unlocking agent because now you're opening up their future in a way that they can feel comfortable. But also now, like just this door is open, and then they don't have to worry about that. They can focus on, finding their client value and showing what their differentiation is against their competitors. And that's what your differentiation did for them. I think that's pretty awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it is really great to help the organization unlock potential because they're held up because they don't have XYZ thing, right? So I think helping them achieve those goals is really satisfying. And then also thinking through of like, what's next, right? Compliance is usually an evolving thing. It's very rare that a company says, we're just going to do one thing and we're not going to go after the next thing. So I think it's also then helping them build out that roadmap of what does it look like for your compliance frameworks to be growing? Are you, do you have a SOC 2? Great. Do you want to go ISO 27001? Great. Do you want to suddenly expand into healthcare? Do you want to do a HIPAA service offering? So I think it's coming up with what are the next things that they need to be thinking about, and then hopefully doing it proactively as opposed to, oh, shoot, now we have that contract that we have to go do this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Good luck with that one. Those are tough, but yeah, it is. Like I said, it's exciting and scary at the same time to be a business builder yourself, to do this stuff. But I just think with the amount of startups that are coming to the fore and the amount of tools that are out there to allow people to start companies, this is the missing piece. So all this other acceleration is happening that's going to hit the same wall. And now you have a chance to come in and really be this enabling agent for all of these people. People talk about AI agents, like, how about your compliance agents? Like, somebody who's going to make sure that we can get to the next step in the growth of our company for the safety and protection of our customers. And that's always what it is. We think of it as like, I'm protecting myself, but I'm not protecting myself when I am compliant. I'm protecting my customers through me, like, because I have to be protected, but the goal is always to protect the customer privacy and data and experience. And it's just, people forget that. People just lose track. And again, they see this as like checkbox compliance and like, oh yeah, I got to do the stupid spreadsheet. I got to remember to do this. Oh, we got the auditor coming in. Everyone's afraid of an audit. An audit is like a spanking. No one's really been through one, but they hear it's really bad. What do you do around that side of the world, Milu? Like, when somebody does, maybe get that call and they're going through an audit, do you help with folks just, maybe they've already had some framework put in place and you can help to guide them through that audit experience? What do you do to help folks around that?
Yeah, so usually, I mean, for the most part, if my clients are in an audit, I'm in the room with them, right? I really try to support them with any independent assessment that they're doing, just because sometimes you also just occasionally need a translator between what the auditor is saying versus what your internal teams are hearing. So I always want to make sure too that I'm in the room and making sure that I'm helping them understand their requirements directly within any independent assessment that they're doing, even if it's one that I'm not necessarily directly involved in. It's just helpful to also just hear what's going on within their audit programs. So I'm always very actively involved in making sure that their audits are happening in a way that I want to make sure that, their team members are representing the company appropriately and that, they're not being asked information that's just like out of scope or something like that. So I'm a pretty active partner within the audit process. And then for the most part too, I'm also pretty involved in planning of making sure that, they are thinking about what's next.
That's important. Yeah, not just here to like, hey, don't forget to fill out your invoice, and once that goes, I'll sit with your audit guy. Like, no. It's like I'll be there the whole way. And also, I do like the idea that you're looking ahead. So, thinking on that, what's ahead right now, industry wise, around compliance? Because I know we've got stuff like the NIST AI framework, and there's a few other things that are really nascent for really nascent industry. So what a challenge. Like, how do you create nascent new compliance frameworks around an industry that doesn't even know what it's doing on a daily basis?
Well, yeah, that's tricky. And again, I think for the AI space specifically, there are some really great frameworks like the NIST AI model. and it's based off of the cybersecurity framework, so it's still relatively familiar for team members within the space. I do think also just making sure the company internally is evaluating like what AI are they using and how are they doing it responsibly, and have they even, created a statement for customers on trust with AI, and do they have a policy internally for onboarding tools? I think you'd be surprised how few companies have actually invested of their internal teams of making sure that their teams are really clear of what they are and aren't allowed to be doing with their AI tools, or even if they're procuring them through company accounts or just all paying for individual ChatGPT licenses. So I think there is something to be said about the importance of creating an AI framework within your organization. Ideally, it's one too that you also disclose for a customer facing audience too, to make sure that you're being really clear and transparent about how your organization is using AI thoughtfully and safely, and making sure that you're being upfront about your AI usage so that it's not a surprise for your customers, that some of their information might be going into those tools.
How do you best, I love the cat in the background. How do you market, what, how do you tell somebody how cool and important this is without it being adversarial and scary? Because this is the one thing that I find in the cybersecurity space is we tend to lead with $4 trillion will be lost this year due to ransomware. And, like we start these really harbingers, like these dark gargoyles of statistics to the point where like, it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your compliance is? And so cybersecurity often has to use a bit of fear to unlock that energy to explore, which I understand, but I don't really like doing that. I don't like starting with these like big numbers. It can sound impressive and it's easy to sound big, but I really like to say like, what does security mean to you? What is the importance to you as an organization, and what does security mean for your clients? Okay, great. Now let's talk about how we get there versus, do you know that, like scare. So how do you maintain telling this exciting story about what's possible with it without having to lean into adversarial and sort of the scare side of it?
I mean, I think regulatory fines are always a really good business enabler in the sense that occasionally it does help the leadership team really understand like, oh shoot, this is the risk. I think for the most part though, if we're thinking about regulatory fines, it's really related to like data protection laws. And for the rest of it, from like a cybersecurity perspective, we don't have the same type of case studies necessarily of saying like, hey, shoot, if we do this the wrong way, we're going to get slapped with XYZ fine, or we can't do business in this thing. So I think it's really coming forward, thinking through with the sales team of, I am always pretty proactive with sales leaders of being like, what are you hearing the customers or prospects are asking for from a compliance and security perspective? Because that's the thing that you want to keep a pulse on, because then you can be more proactive about being like, hey, we lost this deal because we didn't have this thing, or because we haven't thought about how we could solve for X. And so I think it's being mindful of what are the sales leaders hearing within their industry talks and events that they're going to, of what their competitors are, discussing and thinking about from a compliance and security perspective, because that way you can be a little bit more proactive and also occasionally be like, hey, we lost XYZ deal because we didn't have this thing.
Yeah. When it's unfortunately, whenever a deal goes, closed, lost, oh boy, will every salesperson, myself included, look for any reason that was out of my control that stopped this deal from going forward. And it's like compliance is always such an easy, or like legal or some hook where it's just like, oh, they said we didn't have this, so we that was the reason. You're like, we probably could have gotten there if you just have held them on a little longer, type of thing. It's the tricky part of, how do we explain away, why a thing didn't go through, why we lost a customer, or why we lost a potential customer. So it's, we love to blame compliance and the legal team. Sorry, I apologize in advance. A friend of mine, is a managing partner at a VC firm. He says, I had a lawyer once, there wasn't a deal that he couldn't kill with semantics. It was fantastic. He's like, first thing I had to do was get rid of my lawyer. He says, you're killing every single deal because it's going through legal review and it's ending up stopped. He says, I appreciate that we're well protected, but we have no revenue. Can we meet in the middle somewhere?
Right.
What's the most scary thing that you've faced that you're thankful for, having gone through many, many phases of your career?
I think occasionally being tasked with something that you just have no clue what you're doing. I think sometimes it's really good to feel uncomfortable in your lack of knowledge, as saying like, this is a growth opportunity and I'm going to have to go learn something really rapidly to make sure that I can keep up with my job. I think that can occasionally feel really scary when you feel like you don't know what you're talking about. But I think it's also usually a very large learning moment and a huge area of growth for yourself within your career, about being like, I'm about to go explore and do this thing and learn how to do this better and expand my knowledge base. And that's super exciting, but sometimes that's really intimidating.
Yeah, I think that's probably why you have been and will continue to be successful, Milu, because being able to walk into uncertainty with confidence of capability, not necessarily confidence of outcome. You're not saying I'm going to win this, but you're saying I know I can get to the win if I do the right things. And it is rarefied air, to be among people that can do that. And I'm lucky that I've been able to spend time, and I've learned from you already a lot, today, and we've talked a bunch in the past. So I would highly recommend, and I will absolutely endorse folks that need to come and check you out and get involved. So on that, so Compliance Counsel, of course, super cool. Love the name. I always love when wordplay works out to a great company. So it's Compliance Counsel, COUNSEL.com. I'll have links in the show notes as well to make sure we can point people. And what is the best way if people want to get connected and learn more and find out where you can help them to find their compliance future?
Yeah, they can also reach out to me on LinkedIn, Milou Meier. So I'm pretty active there. So definitely always open to reaching out, having people reach out to me there. And then they can also find me on the Socializing Security podcast.
Yeah, it was fun. There's so much more. I was thinking we could have gone in, and we could go on for another 2 hours. I could dive into some of the AI conversation, but I wanted to unpack, because it's exciting to me to learn how you're operating, and immediately I just start to think of brand names of people that I think, okay, I got to remember to connect Milu with, because this is it's a difficult spot, and it's such a great offering. This is exactly what the industry needs. Somebody who can meet them where they are and get them to where they need to be, with a very human-centric approach and a very data and proof in industry backed set of experience like you've got. So it's to me, it's a no-brainer. So I'll make sure I send as many people towards your way as I can. Most importantly, the most important question: how important are pets to the day-to-day operation of your business? You got the most.
Very important. Yes, you can hear. I have a Bengal. He's very chatty. He's in a separate room, and you can still hear him. So, and then I do have a dog who's snoring next to me as well. So they keep me. Nice. My coworkers are pretty active.
They're the best kind of coworkers, because they don't ask to speak up at meetings, and they just like to be fed. So that's pretty cool. I love watching your travels on LinkedIn and seeing you, and it's really, really cool to see how much of a personalized approach you bring to what you do, because it is a very impersonal industry and a very impersonal sort of set of tasks that sometimes people think when they think about compliance and GRC and legal. And it's no, it is 100% human driven. And there's a reason why every time some argument comes up, we're talking about what the framers of the Constitution said. You're well, lots happened since then, but yet it always has to go back to what was the human reason why we did a thing. And for that reason, the very human thing that people should do is reach out to Compliance Counsel, get connected. So there you go. So Milu, thank you so much for this, and good luck. I'm sure we'll be talking about what's coming next. Do you have any events that you're doing? Do you speak at events much? What's that side of the world look like for you?
Currently I'm did a lot of travel in the spring this year, so currently kind of just staying home and focusing on client delivery at the moment, but I think probably in the fall there will be some stuff that comes up too. So I'll definitely post about it on LinkedIn when it's time.
That is good. Well, welcome to entrepreneurship in successful entrepreneurship so far and continued growth. So thanks very much, Milu. I'm really happy that we had the chance to have this chat.
Thanks so much.